Hello, welcome to week 2 of Frostbyte FAQ Fridays. On time this time. Fretless basses. This is a question that I got recently, but something that I was very curious of myself. So simply, bassists might choose fretless because it's desirable. Fretted instruments, that is to say necked instruments, started fretless. Violins, cellos, double bass, all that kind of stuff that didn't have frets on them. It's not until later on where those tonal characteristics were mashed onto a piece of wood. Before, it was just a long line of tone. People say it's more vocal. We don't speak in tones that are like we don't speak in those systematic tones. We speak in a more linear tone. We speak in we speak a very linear analog way, whereas it is very systemic on a fretboard where you go from one to the next note to the next note, and those notes in between are kind of blocked out by a piece of metal. Those notes in between are essentially called natural notes and harmonics, and they're essentially located where these frets would be located on a traditional fretboard or a traditional bass guitar. Now, because of this, you can do a few different things. Not only can you play bass like a normal bass instrument, you can get a different expression on the notes. You can, instead of bending the notes just up and down to get a different expression, you can bend them side to side, or you can really hone in on the notes in between the frets by landing right onto those notes and then sliding. That slide noise, it's called the moi, the M-W-A-H. That's what that desirable kind of slidey tone that you get from a fretless bass is called. You're also able to play a lot of foreign music this way. Middle Eastern music, a lot of the that kind of, I'm not being racist, but a lot of that kind of music, that Eastern music that you hear, which a lot of people will say world or foreign music, it helps in playing those vocal tones, those natural tones. The sitar, which comes from my homeland, has a lot of, it's actually got frets on it, but it's got a lot of them. It's got a lot of strings. The idea is to be able to get a lot of ranges, a long range of notes onto a singular instrument, to be able to make your instrument sing more. Now, fretless basses are generally a little bit more challenging to play. If it's the first instrument you pick up, I do recommend you start with a fretted instrument, with a fretted 4-string bass guitar. The reason being, it's just a little bit more standard. It's easier to learn on, where you're understanding what people are talking about when they say fret 1 or when they're talking about some basic things. But if you do play upright bass, or if you do play a non-fretted instrument, it is very nice to check out fretless bass guitar. That is not to say that you should be afraid of fretless. I tried fretless myself. I really love the way that I can get chords on a fretless bass when I'm playing really high up. I might, if I can get one on this channel, I don't have one, but if I can find one somewhere, if someone will let me borrow one, I might do a video on it, a proper video on it. But fretless basses, people desire them because they are vocal, and they might present a little bit more of a challenge to play, just slightly. It's just a little bit different. Instead of landing in between the frets, you really have to land right on the frets. So it really forces you to be right on. If you are not right on, you are going to get intonation issues and things like that. So when you're really trying to just learn a song, or you're trying to learn the instrument, a fretless bass might present a bit of a challenge where it doesn't need to be. But a little bit later down the line, a fretless bass is fantastic because it really does force you to be better. It forces you to really be spot on, so that when you jump back to a fretless bass, it becomes almost flawless. Another thing is fretless basses that have markers on them versus ones that don't. This simply is an aesthetic thing. I asked a person that was on a Facebook page that I am a part of called Detroit Bass Players. Check them out. His name is Reggie Canty. He's an amazing bass player. He plays fretless. And I asked him, I was like, how do you visualize the fretboard? I didn't ask him why he played, but I asked him what he sees when he sees the fretboard, because he plays a fretless without markers. And so I got a really good answer from him. He said this thing right here. I personally have my binders marked to see where those fret lines should be, but I approach more like the upright players do. I assign one finger to each fret position and focus on what position I'm in to know what's under my hand. Then there's a fingering selection process that determines what finger to use on what note in any given position. I do subliminally see those lines though. When you play a bass without frets that have no markers on it, they'll probably have dots right on the top of the line where you can see, at least from your perspective. But that again just serves to look as natural and as vintage as possible. The markers are really there to help you, and it is recommended that even if you do play fretless, you get a marked bass. If you want to take it away, you can, but it doesn't help in the long run. Fretless bass players to listen to. Jaco Pastorius, of course, fantastic bass player. Steve Bailey, he's really, really good on, he's got a few signature fretless basses. Stanley Clark, he loves upright bass. He likes to do that. I think he likes to do that a little bit more than electric bass. So he's one to listen to when it comes to fretless. Pino Palladino, you know, I'm probably going to list next to my head here, I'm going to list around some more fretless bass players, but those are just some that come to mind. Now, before I leave the fretless subject here, people are going to say, well, you didn't need fret markers on upright basses, and you don't need them on cellos or violins. Of course, instead, actually, I don't even make them like that. And the reason being, the room for error that you get in a longer scale length like that is a lot more than in a shorter scale length. And when you're playing electric, and when you're playing in a band where everybody else is pretty precise, that markless kind of atonal characteristic that you add to it ends up kind of working against you. And that's all I'm making a point to. You can definitely have a markless fretless bass and sound phenomenal. What nationality are you? I am Indian. First thing that you normally will notice about me is that I'm brown, so that I am not a red Indian, right? I'm not Native American. I'm East Indian. I was born in India. I came to this country. Actually, before I came to this country, I lived in Africa for a while. So I lived in Africa. My father, who is not African, his parents were both Indian, so they just moved to Africa. He lived in Africa with his brothers and sisters and his parents for a very long time there. So before we became naturalized in the U.S., we lived in Africa, in Uganda. And then I moved to the United States, and then I lived in Georgia for a while, and then I lived in Wisconsin, and then now I live in Michigan. So a lot of moving around. My nationality is Indian. I'm Indian. I speak a few languages. My parents speak more languages. Yeah, that's something that a lot of people have always asked. I think that question might rival some bass questions. My ethnicity is the #2 subject matter, if not #1 subject matter of the comments that I will get on a video. So there you go. I do encourage people to drink along. If you're of age, definitely have a beer along with me. Don't make me the only person drinking. Boiling bass strings. This is a recent video that you might have seen. It's the experiment where I showed if boiling strings work or what it really does to the strings. Now, the point of this video, which a lot of you got but some of you didn't, is that it is for when you're in a pinch, when you don't have the time or money or resources or whatever it is that you cannot get a new set of strings, but you need a new set of strings, meaning you're gonna record the next day, or you're about to record right now, you're about to play live in front of someone who matters, you know, like a producer or a promoter or something like that. So when you absolutely need a change of strings, you realize that, you know, this it's a make or break kind of thing. You can definitely boil them without damaging your bass and your wallet, and you'd sound fantastic. Now, of course, this isn't ideal, and I say this in the video, but people still find ways to get around that. This isn't ideal. It's just to get yourself out of a pinch, but a lot of times you can bring more life into a set of strings by boiling them if you leave an instrument around for a while. If you leave a bass around, and I've got a lot of basses. I mean, I've got a 4 that I'm looking at right now behind the camera. So not all of them gets the amount of playtime they deserve, and so the strings might die out a little bit more quickly than I want them to. So I might boil the strings once in a while, and it does bring life back into them. So if I'm bringing them into rehearsal, if I'm utilizing that bass the next day, and I feel like, oh, this instrument is really good for a live situation for this set list, I can then put on a fresh set of strings and then continue with that instrument. Another thing that I want to address on that same video is, will it harm your bass to take off all the strings at once? Absolutely not. If your bass is so sensitive, it will bow if you take off every string carefully. Don't just snap them off. Don't use a string cutter or anything and just snap them off. But if you just loosen each string, maybe even wait a few minutes to get your truss rod used to it, and then take the string off, then yeah, you are able to do that. A lot of times that's how basses are cleaned. If you look at any guitar tech for a touring band, they are constantly taking all the strings off and putting all the strings back on the instruments. It is imperative that your instrument can handle that. But, you know, ideally when you're switching strings out, you're doing it string per string so that you're not putting any tension on your truss rod whatsoever. That being said, your truss rod can take the tension need be, and there are times where need be, you need to take the strings off to wash them off. Series versus parallel. This is a bit of an older video that I did, but if you remember, it's just me talking about amplifiers, bass amps, either going out and connecting to 2 cabinets from the amp itself, or from the amp itself to 1 cabinet, and then that cabinet to another cabinet. Now, when I say series, I am not talking about series wiring, as in when you've got a circuit board just sitting there and you're wiring in series. I'm talking about when you refer to something as in series, as a set of series, like when you're daisy chaining pedals. When you have two pedals next to each other, you're daisy chaining them in series, meaning if one pedal in the middle goes out, if it doesn't have the true bypass in between, then you have to take it out and then connect the last pedal to the new pedal. Same exact thing with when I say series. A lot of cabinets are designed to be wired in parallel even when you're coming out of that cabinet into another cabinet. That's kind of a special situation, but generally when you're speaking about going from a cabinet to another cabinet, just like when you're speaking about going from a pedal to another pedal, or you're talking about going from, even on Christmas lights, when you're talking about being wired in series, if one of the Christmas lights busts and all of them stop working, then it's wired in series. If one of them busts and the rest of them stop or keep working, then that is parallel. That's a wiring situation, but there's still going to be a series of Christmas lights. That's how I was referring to it. But no, it's not necessarily series when you're going from cabinet to cabinet. That's just what it's referred to. Is guitar harder than bass? That is something that is generally very variable. Every instrument is hard to play, and every instrument is also easy to play. Every instrument has a beginner level to it, guitar and bass included, and every instrument has an intermediate and advanced level to it. So there are guitar lines that are harder to play than bass lines, and then there's bass lines that would kick the ass of some guitar lines. So it is very, very variable, but I do get this question a lot. Because bass has 4 strings and guitar has 6 strings, is it easier? And no, it's not. When I was growing up, I would look at a bass guitar and think, oh, why does it have 4 strings on it? Is that because it's maybe a training guitar? Is it because it's got a wider neck and more, the frets are bigger? But then you end up finding out that that is not the case at all. And so, yeah, it is not easier to play guitar than it is bass, and vice versa. And there's no such thing as one being better than the other. And there's definitely no such thing as one being easier than the other. So that's going to be it for this FAQ number 2. Hopefully it's going to come out on Friday. Do not be afraid to come to me on Twitter or Facebook. Ask questions down below. Subscribe for more, and I will catch you guys next time. If it dies right now, I'll still be satisfied. The mic gain, got the mic gain.